So most of you here were born somewhat recently, but let's take a trip down memory lane. The year is 1867 and the American Civil War has just reached its conclusion, marked by the treaty at Appomattox Courthouse, as well as the assassination of President Lincoln. Now, especially after the assassination of President Lincoln, there was this huge power vacuum that was left in the United States government. And southern states that were part of the former Confederacy saw this as their perfect opportunity towards reinstating some of the same discriminatory laws that existed under slavery. Now, these policies were commonly referred to as the Black Codes, and one of the main states that were proponents of these laws was Alabama, which I'm sure you all realize is notorious for its history of racism. Now, what the state of Alabama did is that they began to enact extreme voter ID requirements. They began to restrict who could start a business, predominantly targeting Black people. But on a more systematic level, what Alabama did is they began opposing redlining, and moreover, they began simply underfunding Black communities. So in terms of their healthcare infrastructure, in terms of their education infrastructure, in terms of their transportation systems, they were all critically underfunded, further pushing Black people into the system of inequality. Now, this all outraged the North at the time, and Republicans in Congress were brainstorming various solutions on how to address the issue in the South. And ultimately, what they came up with was Reconstruction. Now, Reconstruction in simple terms was a forced military occupation of the South following the Civil War. And what happened is that the Union military oftentimes went from door to door, plantation to plantation, freeing any remaining slaves that hadn't been freed following the Emancipation Proclamation. And furthermore, they also began taking steps to enforce non-discrimination laws, so ensuring that Black people could get better access to education, better access to healthcare, that they could vote without fear of the Black Codes. And Reconstruction was widely successful. We saw how the gap in inequality began to slowly bridge. So, seeing all the success of Reconstruction, it really makes you wonder, why didn't it last? And it really makes you beg the question as to why Reconstruction didn't last. And as you all know, following Reconstruction, there was the implementation of Jim Crow laws across southern states in the 20th century. Now, this was in clear contradiction to the 14th Amendment, which upheld equality for all. Yet, the way southern states managed to implement these Jim Crow laws is through the separate but equal doctrine. Now, the separate but equal doctrine said that people could be separate, but still equal. And it was total bullshit, yet somehow the Plessy versus Ferguson case by the Supreme Court, which was full with Southern racist Dixiecrats, upheld the separate but equal doctrine and provided the fundamental basis for the Jim Crow laws that we saw. And these laws range from simply reinstating some of those extreme voter ID requirements to also including poll taxes, and furthermore, re-implementing redlining. And on a more systematic level, once again, it included massive social segregation. So Black people couldn't use the same restrooms, they couldn't go to the same schools, they couldn't use the same hospitals. You know, if a Black person was on a bus, they would have to give up their seat for a white person, or they would have to sit in the very back. So these kinds of this kind of social discrimination was widespread with the Jim Crow laws. And as you can kind of see, it's almost in a sense 2 steps forward, yet 1 step back. So the Reconstruction was 2 steps forward, yet Jim Crow represented 1 step back. And I often think that this can be likened to the workings of a pendulum. So as you can see, when Reconstruction was in full swing, the pendulum was also swinging in a positive direction. Yet as the pendulum slowed to a stop, and these Jim Crow laws were being implemented, it slowly began to reverse all the way back. And I would stress that this example of the pendulum isn't simply restricted to early times in American history. I'm sure you've all heard about the Dobbs decision by the United Nations. Now, abortion is an extremely controversial issue, and people are very passionate about their opinions regardless of what they are. Yet, I think we can all agree, regardless if you're a devout evangelical Christian, or if Christian conservative, or if you're simply a liberal atheist, that if a woman is a victim of rape or incest, or if a woman is in danger because of her pregnancy, that she should be able to get an abortion. And this is backed up by empirical evidence and through polling that the vast majority of the American public do support these exceptions for abortion rights. Yet that is not the case that we're seeing in the aftermath of Dobbs. Take Michigan, for example, one of the first states to implement abortion restrictions due to a trigger law that they had from over 100 years ago. And what this trigger law stated is that if there was no national guidance on abortion, which there isn't following Dobbs, then immediately all abortions would be banned in the state of Michigan, even for victims of rape or incest, or when the life of the mother is at risk due to her pregnancy. Now, despite this being extremely reprehensible, inhumane, and not supported by virtually all of the American public, it is the case in many states across the United States. So while we see this kind of massive step forward with Roe, which many argued was a step too far, Dobbs has taken us so far back to the point where now virtually none of us agree with the status quo across many states in the Union. And again, this is not simply restricted to America, it does apply on a worldwide scale. We saw how even with the Romans, like thousands of years ago, that when the pendulum was in full swing forward, it had this massive rate of expansion. Yet as the pendulum slowly began to swing back, the Roman Empire started to decline until it ultimately collapsed. Now, you may ask, what are the causes of this pendulum phenomenon that we see in history? And in particular, I think the main cause of this pendulum phenomenon is misinformation. So misinformation comes in various forms, whether it's on social media or whether it's on mainstream media, it can come in virtually any form. Yet, as it continues to proliferate in our country, we see how this misinformation is causing increased polarization, increased radicalization among large portions of the American public. Now, many of you may be unconcerned with this radicalization. You may be, well, at worst, some people think Area 51 is full of aliens, or at worst, people are wearing lizard costumes, or at worst, the Earth is flat. So you may think at worst those are the kinds of people who are being radicalized and those are their beliefs. Yet it does apply on a much larger scale. Now, I know most of you here have been in some kind of lockdown drill in high school, and when you really think about the reason as to why you've been in that lockdown drill, it's because there is this omnipresent fear in our country that school shootings will happen, and it will be at your school because we see it happen on the news so much, even recently in Uvalde here in Texas. And this fear only exists because of the level of radicalization that is affecting people's mental health across the country. People are no longer listening to voices of reason. They're entering these echo chambers in which they are so dead set on their beliefs, using confirmation bias, that they're no longer even approachable by people, by other people, whether it be their family or their friends. And ultimately, this doesn't simply just affect our schools. It also affects our grocery stores, which are also having shootings. Movie theaters, clubs, bars, anywhere it may be, are all affected by this. And it's not simply just restricted towards shootings. We see how there's a massive uptick in crime recently in our country, but we also see how recently in our country there's a great amount of political violence, and moreover, there's a great amount of anti-Asian violence. And lastly, there's also a lot of anti-Semitism happening in our country. And all of these are a result of misinformation going around, telling people that certain groups are less, certain groups are a threat, or other kinds of misinformation that is being proliferated by mainstream media or social media. And I know I just talked about a lot of doom and gloom. Sometimes when we go back, it can be beneficial. I mean, personally, I would love to go back to the era of 2002 filmmaking with Lord of the Rings and seeing Eowyn kill the Witch King. But I digress. This does definitely pose an extreme threat to our country. And in particular, I'd like to stress that it's happening all around you right now. People just scrolling through social media, seeing a post that isn't necessarily verifiable, but there's just so much misinformation going around, and the radicalization of this country is happening so much, as you can see by this uptick in violence, that it is a real problem. So I want to ask all of you, do you envision yourself in a society where it's friend versus friend? Do you envision yourself in a society where it's family versus family? Do you envision yourself in a society where it's neighbor versus neighbor? Because that is our future. That is our future if we can't stop the pendulum. And I, for one, can say that I am going to hear out the people around me, listen to their opinions, listen to their standpoint, and what they believe in. But even if I disagree with them, having this dialogue is extremely important to making sure that we're all on the same page, that we respect each other, that way our country doesn't increase in the divisiveness that we're seeing right now, and that our democracy can stay strong. And that is an extremely core tenet of our American freedoms, this right to free speech, but also being responsible with it. And if we don't manage to stem the tide of misinformation, if we don't manage to stem the tide of the pendulum, and if we don't manage to stop all of the violence that's occurring in this country, we will simply not have a democracy left, and our country will collapse.